You handed me an Arnold Palmer, and according to Donald Trump, this is about the size of Arnold Palmer's. I don't know why that was so hard to say. It was the story of the news cycle, I think, yesterday. So he was at a rally, and it was at like a hotel, or it was like at a place that Arnold Palmer. I think it was like the town he was from or something. And when you're in a rally, like, oh yeah, this is where Arnold Palmer was born. Talk about that, right? He's also clearly going senile. So he just starts like rambling about how Arnold Palmer, he was a real man, and they were golfing one time, and he's like, when he came out of the showers, like all the other athletes, you couldn't believe it. It was unreal, that thing. And it's just like,
I mean, perfect for his crowd.
I wish people would stop covering his shenanigans, because I think it just makes the liberals look stupid and like we can't take a joke. When they take stuff that he clearly said as a joke and then start reporting on it like he was being serious, it just makes them look stupid, because obviously that was a joke.
I think he should be a stand-up comedian. I think when the president thing ultimately fails, when he is not elected for a second term. The guy's got jokes. They're not all bangers, but when he hits one, damn. Right?
I think he should buy InfoWars and retool it and just have a podcast.
Oh yeah, that's what'll happen.
Yeah.
From jail. It's fine. You can have a podcast in jail, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I would love to watch that. Yeah, I would watch a Donald Trump podcast from jail. I mean, that would be like hilarious.
Yeah. It'd be pretty good.
Like objectively.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be putting anyone in a position of public trust. Are we ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Greetings and welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast about women and women first. My name is Sovereign Syre. I am a writer, a comedian, and a hungry-ass ghost.
And I'm Josh, your resident skeptic, pop culture enthusiast, and why call the cops when you have these two guns?
Ooh, I got tickets to the gun show.
Oh, God. Pea shooters. Now, we here at Ill Repute support women's rights, but more importantly,
we support women's wrongs.
So, Sav, which women's wrongs are we writing today?
So, today we're talking about Ruthie Mae McCoy, the real-life inspiration for the urban legend of Candyman. You familiar?
Yes. The movie from 1992, which had Todd. I can't remember if this actor's last name is Todd or his first name is Todd. Right. Something Todd. I think it's something Todd, and it's the last name because it's weird. Because why is Todd his last name when that's obviously a first name? He's a great actor.
Yeah.
He's been in a lot of horror stuff. I always think of him as like the contemporary. He's got a very Vincent Price vibe about him, which I think is probably why he does a lot of horror stuff. He's Candyman, and then Virginia Madsen is a white woman living very hot, and she's living in Chicago, and
she's an anthropology student.
Is that what it is? I thought she was a journalist.
She's an anthropology student, and she's studying the urban legend of Candyman.
It's a very kinky movie. There's a lot of there's a little bit of race play stuff going on. The story of Candyman is super up. It's the great story, and I like the movie. And it has an amazing intro where they're flying over the top of Chicago.
Yeah.
And you're seeing all the architecture. It's a cool movie. If you haven't seen Candyman, I need to
watch it again.
Yeah, you should definitely watch. Visually, it's very beautiful. It's a really cool story.
Yeah.
It did not get the accolades it deserved when it was out, I think.
And I think it was one of the first movies that I can remember that was horror centered around Black people.
Yes.
Like, I'm really trying to, the only other one I can think of was the original Night of the Living Dead, which the filmmaker said was specifically about race and was done in the 60s. And it was about white fears around ending segregation.
Oh, wow.
And so the zombies came to represent what white fear of the unknown, the other coming into the community.
Yeah, well, just how the world was changing and the old people didn't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
And they now had...
Which is why, so one of the leads was a Black man, Black actor. And so, but still, the story of it wasn't focused around Blackness.
Yeah, with Candyman, I think Clive Barker wrote the story, or was it?
We're going to get to that, but yeah, it was first based off of a Clive Barker story, but that story took place in England.
Okay.
And so it was kind of like adapted and then fudged around a little bit.
Yeah, because there's definitely the thing about the pretty white woman and then the black dude. There's a whole thing going on around that.
Yeah.
And the Candyman figure is sort of like a tragic figure. It's a revenge story in a way.
Yeah.
I thought it was a remake. In the script, you say it's a sequel. It's not a...
I believe, now I'm questioning myself. I believe there was a sequel that was made that was a straight-to-video situation. And then in 2021, Jordan Peele produced
a remake
that was pretty decidedly different. Like, it really it was a lot more meta in its...
Yeah, I mean, that's Jordan Peele for you, right?
Yeah, in its purpose.
Yeah.
So...
But yeah, original Candyman is visually, if nothing else, a really amazing looking movie. And it gets into a lot about, like, surprisingly, so we'll talk more about it as we go into the script, but it gets a lot into how Chicago is built as a city and how that plays into why people live the way they do there.
Yeah.
And why poverty and racism are the way they are there. It's really crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway. So I've seen the movie. It's a good movie.
All right. So we're going to read the article that started it all and then react to it as we go.
Okay.
But before we dive into the real life case that inspired Candyman, which I didn't know until a few years ago when I stumbled upon this article. So there was a site called Longform, which now no longer exists. It's kind of become a subreddit where people post really good long form journalism that usually comes from underground weeklies or alt weeklies around the country.
So almost citizen, like indie reporting, not affiliated with a large network or Clearwater Communication, whatever the fuck it's called. Yeah.
And because I'm a writer and a screenwriter, I really love that for when I'm looking for IP and ideas. There's a lot of really cool, weird, kind of offbeat stories that are only going to be reported by a local underground weekly. Like they're not going to be reported in headline news, and they're in depth. These are, 5 pages instead of 5 paragraphs.
Gotcha.
Right.
I mean, it's for people who read, and it's complicated, nuanced, challenging material. It's not like Harry Potter.
A lot of it is kind of true crimey or white collar crimey, or those are a lot of the stories that become the subject of. But a lot of those things do get turned into the movies that you see.
Okay, yeah.
So
I mean, it has to come from somewhere.
Yeah. Like things that start as like a local story. One that comes to mind right away is a fertility doctor that it turned out that he was using his own sperm. And it came out because...
Sorry, that's not funny. That's
It came out because in the age of DNA testing, a bunch of people found out that they were matching. And there's certain things that they do at sperm banks to like make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Like a sample will be like taken out of circulation for a period of time so this thing doesn't happen, so that you don't have like multiple people
who are all related to each other.
Yeah. For obvious that could cause.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So before we dive into the real life case that inspired Candyman, let's set the stage by talking about the legend itself, how it started, where it came from, and why it freaks people out so much.
The whole Candyman myth didn't just pop up out of nowhere. We mostly know it because of the 1992 movie Candyman. But the story behind it is pretty layered. In the movie, he's this vengeful spirit with a hook for hand, haunting the Cabrini Green housing projects in Chicago. And of course, if you say his name 5 times in a mirror, well, that's where the real horror begins.
I did some research because I was like, I don't really think about it very much. But the idea of summoning a ghostly figure through a mirror comes from, obviously, the older, well-known urban legend, Bloody Mary.
I have a funny story about that.
So if you don't know, the ritual involves standing in front of a mirror, often in a dark room, and chanting Bloody Mary a set number of times to summon her.
Okay, side note. So when I was in high school, so there was this girl who was Wiccan who really liked my friend, and he invited her over to his house one night to come hang out. And she was very superstitious. Immediately, she brought up the Bloody Mary thing and said that she had done it. And I was like, bullshit. Let's go in the fucking room right now and I'll fucking do it a zillion times and nothing's going to fucking happen.
Right.
And I was like, we're getting to the bottom of this right fucking now. Do you know how bad I want to see a ghost? It was a move, but it was really funny to be like, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. She kept saying, well, you got to do it this way. You got to do it that way. You got to do it this way. And I was like meeting every criteria. And I'm like, come on, baby. When's it going to happen? Never happened. Sorry. Bloody Mary myth busted. Anyway.
Well, maybe she only appears to people that believe they have to have like a hole in their soul.
Those lucky motherfuckers. I need the proof before the pudding.
It's like Atreyu and the horse.
I can't just bog of sadness, shove fucking spoonfuls of that pudding in my mouth without knowing what's in it. Sorry.
This dare has its roots in old folklore about mirrors being portals to other worlds or revealing hidden truths. And it plays on our fear of seeing something we shouldn't, something that shouldn't be there. But I thought that was really interesting that it stems from an old ass belief that mirrors are.
Humans have a thing, right? We have this pattern recognition thing about looking at other people. We're built to recognize other people very specifically. Yeah. And we're built to know the difference between when we're looking at a person and when we're not looking at a person. Our sensitivity to that's the uncanny valley, right?
Right.
Now, some anthropologists think that has a lot to do with, there was a certain point where we had other hominids walking around on the earth that looked similar to us, except they would eat us. And so we had to know if we were looking at another thing that looked relatively human-like, if it was going to attack us. That's the theory of where uncanny valley comes from.
So is that the fear? So is that like vampires and zombies and all of that stuff and werewolves? Do you think that
if we see something that is beyond our understanding of the natural world, the tendency is to create some kind of
story,
some sort of reason. And if it's really terrifying, it has to be a very powerful reason because we need to justify the anxiety we're experiencing in that moment, right?
Yeah.
And so I think a mirror is sort of one of those things where you're looking at something that is human, but you know it's not human. And I think that's why some animals freak out when they see it, because they're like, what the It's like, that's a thing, but it's not a thing.
Well, like even now, mirrors can be scary because there's that trope in movies of like you look in the mirror and then you see something behind you, right?
Well, have you ever done mushrooms and looked in the mirror for a long time? It's an unnerving experience. You open yourself up to certain ideas and then...
I'm a virgin who can't drive, so I wouldn't know about...
You're missing out, sister. Mirrors are pretty powerful symbols. They're reflective but also distorting, making them a natural medium for tales of the supernatural. Plus, there's this psychological effect called the Troxler effect, where if you stare at something long enough, your brain starts filling in the gaps. That's what that's called.
Well, no, you're talking about something different.
No, I know, but this is definitely, I know this too. I know this. I've experienced this as well. That's why people often think they see a ghostly face appear. It's your mind playing tricks on you. But there's something thrilling about daring fate, about calling out to the unknown, which makes the Bloody Mary myth and later Candyman so compelling.
So the Candyman story draws heavily from this tradition, but adds a new dimension. In the movie, Candyman is not just a ghost, he's a figure tied to historical trauma. A black man who was lynched in the 19th century for loving a white woman. Summoning him isn't just about testing bravery, it's about invoking something much darker, something tied to generational pain and violence.
And that's what makes the Candyman myth stand out. Cabrini Green wasn't just a setting for the scary movie, it's a real housing project in Chicago, notorious for its crime rates, poverty, and systemic neglect. The horror in Candyman wasn't just about a supernatural entity, it's about the very real fear of being forgotten, isolated, and unsafe.
This is where the story of Ruthie Mae McCoy comes in. Ruthie lived in the ABLA housing projects in Chicago, another set of high-rise buildings like Cabrini Green. In 1987, she made a frantic call to 911 saying that someone was trying to break into her apartment through her bathroom mirror. And she wasn't imagining things. People had figured out that in these buildings, you could remove a medicine cabinet and crawl through the wall space to enter a neighboring apartment. That's how her killers got in.
What's chilling is how this mirrors the Candyman myth. In the film, Candyman appears through a mirror when his name is called. In Ruthie Mae's case, the mirror was a point of vulnerability. It's a haunting reminder that a horror doesn't always need a ghost. It's already there in the way people live or are forced to live in forgotten parts of society.
I think that's why Candyman became such like a cult classic, is because every once in a while, a horror movie comes out that has more depth than probably even its writers or creators necessarily intended. And it resonates with something just a little bit more primal. And that's the reason that some become these classics, like Last House on the Left. on its surface, it's sort of just shock exploitation, but there's something about it. The theme of happy, normal people then invaded by people that have no motive. They're just nihilistic.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And that forces the family members to find within themselves the darkest angels of their nature to perpetrate revenge. That theme is larger than a horror film. That theme is one of our more visceral fears as a human being. Like, what would I do and how far would I go?
Yeah, and I think that was big in the 80s because the way crime was reported in the 80s was that it was this affliction that was eventually going to hit you and it would come out of nowhere and it wouldn't be your fault. And
also, it was really bad.
No, absolutely. Violence
was really
bad, but it was also depicted in this way that, like, how is this happening? And it's like, well, poverty and segregation. There's a lot of very reasonable motivating factors that could have been addressed in a meaningful way to prevent it. And just no one wanted to accept their responsibility in it, which is really what was going on, right? So they made Last House on the Left. They made the Death Wish movies. They made all these like movies where a white guy, importantly, gets challenged in some way, has someone close to him die, and then that completely justifies his use of force to kill anybody that does anything to him.
Right.
Which makes for a compelling story. I mean, it's emotionally wrenching to watch, but it also creates a narrative that isn't necessarily true or accurate to what is happening to the people who are living in these conditions all the time, right? Anyway, big digression.
So this wasn't an isolated incident. The conditions of the housing projects allowed real horrors to happen. When Ruthie Mae called 911 and said they're coming through the bathroom, it should have set off alarms. But when police arrived and knocked, they left when she didn't answer. Her body wasn't discovered until 2 days later.
It highlights how people living in these communities were often treated as invisible. Cabrini Green, ABLA, and the other projects like them were isolated from the rest of the city. The isolation let myths grow, but it also allowed real problems like violence, poverty, and systemic neglect to fester without solutions.
The Candyman film took these elements and crafted a horror story that was also a commentary on systemic issues: racism, poverty, urban decay, and the fear of the other. By connecting Candyman to a real place like Cabrini Green, the filmmakers gave the legend a deeper, more menacing context. The fear wasn't just about summoning a ghost. It was about confronting a history that still haunts the present.
And I think there's not a lot of horror movies that address the fears that Black people have.
Yeah, that's what I meant earlier.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of like Black horror besides the Jordan Peele thing that's happening. And I don't necessarily think those are. I mean, I think us and them are definitely the audience is a Black people, or Black people living in America. But I think there's Candyman and there's another Wes Craven movie, The People Under the Stairs. I think that's a really good movie.
The only ones I can think of are like parodies. Like parody films.
No, the original Blackula there's a movie, Scream, Blackula Scream, is actually an amazing horror movie. It's really, really good.
Yeah. I feel like we're going to get people writing in saying, you guys are imbeciles. Did you not know about? And then they're going to list off like 15 cult classic horror films by Black directors and writers and performers.
But yeah, People Under the Stairs is also really good. If you like horror movies, I definitely recommend that one.
Yeah.
And Scream, Blackula Scream. Because I think there's a bunch of Blackulas, but Scream, Blackula Scream is the one that is like genuinely an amazing movie.
Yeah. Oh, there was the Eddie Murphy...
A Vampire in Brooklyn.
I
heard that was a legit good movie. I never saw it. The 2021 Candyman sequel took these themes even further, framing Candyman as not just of one figure, but a representation of how violence against Black men, particularly by the state, has been perpetuated throughout history. It turned Candyman into a cycle of trauma, showing us how these issues don't just go away. They persist because the roots of the problem, like racism and systemic neglect, haven't been dealt with.
Yeah. Like it has really good art and stuff. I think there was part of it for me was that it just felt a little too self-conscious. And that like it kind of forgot that at its heart, it's a horror movie. I want to be scared. I want some jump scares. I want my expectations to be subverted in some way in terms of.
So there's a lot of commentary, not enough horror stuff.
I felt, yeah.
Okay.
And I feel like when it came out, reviews kind of were similarly like it forgot the main element that it needed to have, which is it needed to be scary. You know, it needed to instill a sense of fear in the viewer. So today we're going to dive into the article that documented Ruthie Mae McCoy's tragic story as we read think about how her case reflects so many of the themes we've just talked about, how fear, urban myths, and real-life horror intersect.
It's important to keep in mind that Ruthie Mae's story isn't just a one-off. It's a snapshot of what life was like in those projects and how the system failed to protect people. And when we hear about Candyman or urban legends like it, it's worth remembering how those myths grow out of very real fears.
So I wanted to, this is our Halloween special. The reason I wanted to just read the article is that I found it on Long Reads. It's a kind of journalism that is dying. And I wanted to platform it and just maybe spark an interest in listeners to go to that subreddit of Long Reads and look around and take the time to just sit with something for 20, 30 minutes and read it and get engaged.
I'll post a link in the show notes.
So with that, the title of the article is called "They Came In Through the Bathroom Mirror, A Murder in the Projects" by Steve Bogira, September 3rd, 1987.
Article starts. Ruthie Mae McCoy was the type who talked to herself and cursed strangers on the street. When she called 911 to report that someone was coming in through the medicine cabinet of her Abbott Homes apartment, she might have been hallucinating, but she wasn't. Ruthie Mae McCoy was terrified. "Something has threatened my life," she gasped to the woman next to her. They were riding in a van that was taking them home from an outpatient psychiatric center at Mount Sinai Hospital. The woman urged McCoy to relate her fears to the staff members at the clinic, but McCoy said she didn't want to get anyone else involved.
So we're already starting with marginalized.
She might be an unreliable narrator. She's already suffering through a bunch of stuff.
Well, I mean, you just said it right there, that people that have mental health issues are far less likely to be believed, which also makes them far more vulnerable as like victims of crime, especially like the kind of like sexual abuse and other kind of things that happen in psychiatric hospitals, or caretaker abuse, elder abuse, things like that. In 1987, like we have some awareness around it now, but in 1987, people didn't even admit they went to therapy in the 80s. Like it was very, very stigmatized. The article continues. McCoy, 52, went through much of her life afraid. She was hounded by paranoia. Her fears weren't soothed by her dwelling place the last 4 years, a high-rise building in a near Southside Chicago Housing Authority project known as ABLA, where the van dropped her off this Wednesday afternoon, April 22nd. She lived in one of the 7 15-story brown Y-shaped towers named the Grace Abbott Homes, the most dangerous buildings in ABLA. A claustrophobe in a closet might be more at ease than a paranoid like McCoy in the Abbott high-rise. The buildings feature dark, malfunctioning elevators, pitch black stairwells, and cocaine and PCP addicts on nearly every floor. Fiends really are lurking in the shadows here. In these towers, you're crazy if you're not always looking over your shoulder. McCoy lived at the end of a corridor on the 11th floor of the building at 1440 West 13th Street.
At 8:45 this April evening, Chicago police got a 911 call from McCoy. "I'm a resident at 1440 West 13th Street, and some people next door are totally tearing this down, you know," her frantic voice began. "What are they doing, ma'am?" asked the dispatcher. McCoy's response is unintelligible on tape, but apparently the dispatcher caught her gist. "They went to break in?" he asked. "Yeah, they threw the cabinet down." The dispatcher: "From where?" McCoy: "I'm in the projects. I'm on the other side. You can reach my bathroom. They want to come through the bathroom." Dispatcher: "All right, ma'am. What's the address?" 1440 West 13th Street, apartment 1109. The elevator's working." Dispatcher: "1109? All right. What's your name, ma'am?" McCoy: "Ruth McCoy." "All right. I'll send you the police."
The dispatcher wasn't certain what McCoy had been trying to report. What could she have meant by "they throwed the cabinet down" and "they want to come through the bathroom"? Nevertheless, he closed the phone call in order to send a beat car on its way. He assigned a 12th District car to answer a, quote, "disturbance with a neighbor" complaint at 1440 West 13th Street, apartment 1109. That he didn't report the call as a break-in attempt may explain why police hadn't yet arrived at McCoy's door at 9:02 when another 911 call came in concerning apartment 1109. This one was from a woman who said she had been walking through the hallway and heard gunshots from the apartment. At 9:04, another neighbor called to report gunshots and hollering from 1109. 2 more police cars headed to the scene.
4 officers apparently arrived at McCoy's door around 10 minutes after 9. They pounded on the door, announced their presence, and called for McCoy. No answer. They asked the dispatcher to call McCoy on her phone. "We think somebody may be in there holding somebody," an officer told the dispatcher over the radio. The officers listened to the phone ring and ring. There were 2 more officers downstairs, and they drove to the project office a block away on Loomis to get the key to 1109. But the key didn't fit McCoy's lock. This left the officers wondering what to do. Should they break into the apartment? Talking with neighbors didn't help much. The apartment next door was vacant, and the neighbors in the apartment down the hall said no, they hadn't heard or seen anything. Other neighbors on the floor said an elderly woman lived in 1109. They say that she always answers the door. One of the officers told the dispatch in a hesitant voice, "And there's no answer, so I don't know if maybe she answered to the wrong person or what."
The officers contacted the project office again, but the janitor there said he had no other key for 1109. And so at 9:48 p.m., the police left McCoy's building and the project. That's just like crazy to me. You've got gunshots. Someone's called 911. It's crazy to me that you wouldn't.
Cops are not legally obligated to risk their lives, so if there's a situation where they know that they could die, they can just leave.
The article continues. The following evening, police got a call from Deborah Lastly, an 11th floor neighbor of McCoy's. Lastly said McCoy normally stopped by her apartment on her way out of the building every morning and upon her return in the afternoon. But this day, she hadn't stopped by at all. Lastly had seen police at McCoy's door the night before and was worried. About a half dozen police officers and 4 or 5 CHA security guards arrived on the scene. Their knocks and calls for McCoy went unanswered. Most of the police officers thought they ought to break down the door, neighbors say, but the security guards discouraged them. One of them raised the possibility of the tenants suing if the police broke in. And if you bust down the door, the security guards told the police officers, "You will have to get someone up here to secure it." The police officers shrugged and left.
The next day, Lastly notified the project office of her concerns. At about 1 p.m., a project official arrived at McCoy's door with a carpenter who drilled the lock. They found McCoy in the bedroom, lying on her side in a pool of blood, a hand over her chest, one shoe on, one shoe off. Papers, magazines, and coins were strewn about her on the floor. When the police later returned McCoy slightly, the faint smell of rotting flesh rose through the apartment. This is a trigger warning. They're going to describe in pretty graphic detail what her mortal wounds were, so if you do not want to hear graphic descriptions of trauma, please skip ahead. She had been shot 4 times, probably with a gun of medium caliber. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy, Dr. Yupil Choi, told me 1 bullet passed through her left shoulder, another passed through her thigh, a third entered her right side of her abdomen, pierced the liver, and exited through the side of her abdomen. The 4th and fatal bullet passed through her upper arm, then entered her chest and severed the pulmonary vein. Choi listed the cause of death as internal bleeding. McCoy probably didn't die immediately, Choi says, but because of the injury to the pulmonary vein, a principal vessel in the lung, he doubts she lasted long. She probably wouldn't have survived even if she had been taken quickly to a hospital, he says. She was pronounced dead at Cook County Hospital at 4:35 p.m. Friday, April 24th.
Oh, brutal. Unless there's something extraordinary about it, or unless there's a news hole needing plugging, a murder in a CHA project isn't going to make the Sun-Times or Tribune. Project killings just aren't news ordinarily. CHA, which is Chicago Housing Authority, residents are blown away, knifed, and kicked to death almost every week, 2 or 3 times a week in warmer weather. McCoy was only one of 3 ABLA residents murdered in the waning days of April. 2 days after her body was found, unknown assailants used a stick in their hands and feet to beat to death a 40-year-old man who lived in an ABLA row house. The killing occurred on a street just 2 blocks east of McCoy's building. 3 days after that, a 25-year-old female resident of one Abbott high-rise ended an argument with a 20-year-old resident of McCoy's building by plunging a knife into her chest. That killing took place just outside McCoy's building.
The murder of a middle-aged, mentally ill CHA tenant merited coverage soon afterward only in the Black-owned Defender, which I'm assuming is like a newspaper in Chicago.
Like an all-weekly, yeah.
McCoy probably knew her attacker or attackers. Police said in the Defender story, because there was no indication they had forced their way in. I think we're going to see what's going on here. The Tribune did run a brief story on the McCoy murder on June 10th after a second suspect had been arrested and indicted. The killing apparently had been made newsworthy by a new fact detectives had determined, and the Tribune reported in the story's lead, that McCoy's killers had entered her apartment through her medicine cabinet. They removed the cabinet in the adjacent apartment, broke through McCoy's cabinet, and climbed through the wall into her apartment, according to the story.
And then you put the cabinet back in when you leave. The article also noted that McCoy had heard the intruders attempting to break in and called 911, that someone else also called 911 and reported gunshots from the apartment, but that when police arrived, they, quote, knocked on the door, got no answer, and left, unquote. Her body was discovered 2 days later, the story said. The facts disclosed in the Tribune article raised some intriguing questions. What kind of place is it where a person can get killed by people coming through her medicine cabinet? And how could police, having received those 911 calls, neglect to enter McCoy's apartment the first night? But these angles apparently did not captivate news editors. The Tribune article, which ran deep in its Chicagoland section, would be the last story on the killing in any Chicago daily, The Defender included. So there, eloquently, our author is throwing some serious shade. So shout out to him. I have it linked at the bottom. It's like the Chicago Reader or something, but like he's basically saying like, we're better reporters. Like we see the angles and we go get those angles, right?
The editor's indifference is understandable. In the CHA towers, babies have been tossed out of windows and teenagers shoved down elevator chutes. Intruders sometimes bust right through the apartment walls to rape and murder tenants. So what's unusual about a medicine cabinet murder?
That is bleak.
Damn.
That is bleak.
News of who got killed and how had quickly buzzed through the Abbott high-rises, long before their Tribune story. Not many were shocked, says Abbott janitor. He prefers anonymity. We'll call him simply the janitor. You get desensitized by what goes on here every day, the janitor says. It's animalism over there. That's the prevailing life condition of the people, animalism, where you worry about those who are stronger and you care nothing about those who are weaker.
Oof, that's a word.
Poetry right there.
That really is. Wow.
I
That's
mean, it's got to be crazy to work there.
He probably lives there as well. They probably live there in exchange for free housing.
Well, and the other thing is, though, a lot of the people don't see how the other people there live, and they're one of the few people who have the forbidden knowledge of like what, like how people,
like maintenance people, janitors,
like they see something.
Yeah. The mode of entry didn't startle residents of the high-rises. Abbott intruders have been breaking into their apartments through medicine cabinets for at least a year. Even the dullest youth here knows you can slither from one apartment to the adjacent one through the pipe chase, about 2.5 feet across between the cabinets. The cabinets themselves, secured by only 6 nails, are no obstacle. In some areas of the building, you can even climb vertically into the pipe chase to an apartment above or below the one you start in. Quote, it's the way to go from one apartment to the next, even if you're not killing nobody, the janitor says.
It's the way to go.
Jesus.
Gangbangers who take over a pair of adjacent vacant apartments now often link them by taking down the medicine cabinets, providing an escape route should security or police enter one of the apartments. The escape hatch is particularly effective, says Area 4 Detective Ray Lauser, who investigated the McCoy murder, because the medicine cabinet opening is small, only about 1.5 feet wide, and there are pipes to squirm past. Quote, a lot of policemen wouldn't be able to make it through there, Lauser says. I think I wouldn't be able to make it through. These guys are enjoying them famous Chicago chili dogs. I've heard Chicago has some big boys. The men over there.
Well, they have pizza that's essentially like a crust, and then a pizza soup is poured into the crust, and then they call it Chicago deep dish. And it's the Midwest, and people that live in cold environments tend to eat heavier foods, especially in the winter, because
and that makes
you need it. You need it. New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, like they all have this very shishi la la kind of attraction draw to them. San Francisco, it was to be gay. Los Angeles and New York, it's to be famous. Chicago, you don't go to Chicago to become a star. So Chicago is a big hub for business and stuff, but the overall ethos of the people is not grounded in fantasy. It's grounded in this kind of very...
Gotta work.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
As for the police officer's failure to enter McCoy's apartment, well, some 911 stories are just more significant than others. The death of Nancy Clay, a white, suburban, white-collar worker in a Loop high-rise blaze in May, and indications that the 911 system had failed her, prompted weeks of media coverage, a city council investigation, a council hearing featuring testimony by the fire commissioner, broadcast live on public radio, and several proposed ordinances. The performance of the police in the McCoy case didn't even merit a departmental investigation.
A police department spokesperson first told me she couldn't discuss the officer's actions in the McCoy case because a full-scale investigation was in progress. Everyone would be interviewed, she assured me, the officers, the security guards, neighbors. When I inquired later about the progress of the investigation, the spokesperson said she had been mistaken. There was really no investigation, nor need for one. Captain Raymond Risley, that's a crazy name, Raymond Risley, the Rizzler.
He's got Riz.
He's got the Riz.
He's got the Riz.
It's in his name. Captain Raymond Risley, an assistant to the superintendent, said an informal check he conducted to answer my query satisfied him that the officers had acted properly in not breaking into McCoy's apartment, though their decision was a tough call, a coin toss, unquote. Had the 9/11 calls come from somewhere other than a housing project, the officers perhaps would have forcibly entered the apartment to check on the resident, Risley says. But so many 911 calls from the projects are hoaxes, he says, and officers have to consider when choosing their course of action. No neighbors or security guards were contacted for this inquiry. The department would not disclose to me the identities of the responding officers.
This is, again, journalism that you won't see very often anymore. How often have you been reading an article online and said, they told me I got no response? You don't see that very much because so much of journalism today is reporting on other reports of other reports. You have very few people that are actually doing actual reporting, picking up the phone and actually calling someone and asking questions. They read articles other people have written and then they compile it. And it's just, they call it churnalism. It's just this like... Churnalism. Yeah. And it's also that a lot of the news that you get is they're sent a press release and they oftentimes barely even edit it and then they post it.
Damn.
Yeah. So a lot of times the news you're reading is written by someone in PR. Yeah. But then in Abbott homes, where elevators sit out of order for days and burned out light bulbs in the corridors and stairwells aren't replaced for weeks and apartments remain vacant for months, finding a body in a day and a half is pretty efficient. Like other CHA projects made up mainly of high-rises, Abbott Homes is characterized mostly by its stagnancy. Bounded by Roosevelt and 15th, Loomis, and Ashland, it's a little island with no through streets. The project's designers thought that by eliminating the streets, they could give residents more recreational space and a heightened sense of community. Today, Abbott's open spaces are seldom used, save by residents trying to get home before they get jumped. The lack of through streets has helped isolate the project from the rest of the world. No one can even drive through the development. For Abbott residents, there's no need for streets. Most of them aren't going anywhere. Oof. Fear of crime keeps them pinned to their apartments day in and day out. Something harder to understand welds many residents to this place for generations. They have kids and grandkids down the hall.
Beneath the more sensational details of the McCoy murder is the story of Ruthie Mae herself, a mentally ill woman trying to survive in a CHA project. Miss May, as she was known at Abbott, used to dress like a bag lady, curse strangers, and wave a stick at teens in her path. But she had turned over a new leaf in the months before her death. Neighbors say she was dressing decently, she was less ornery, very often pleasant. She left the project early most weekday mornings. She said she was going to school.
Mentally ill residents of CHA projects face a double struggle. They have demons inside them to battle as well as the ones around them. But McCoy was on the verge of escaping the project madness also. 2 months before her death, with the help of a Social Security field representative and staff members at the Mount Sinai Psychiatric Center, McCoy had gotten approved to receive Supplemental Security Income, SSI, federal aid for the physically and mentally disabled. This raised her monthly income from the $154 she had been receiving from general assistance to $340. SSI is paid retroactive to the date of application, and McCoy applied in September. So the first check she was sent, dated February 10th, was a big one, for $1,979. McCoy intended to use most of her windfall to get out of public housing. But she also bought a few things: a plain winter coat, a few other clothes, some inexpensive household items. People in the project, very observant, noticed. Detectives think the killers invaded her apartment because they figured she had a tiny sum stashed there. The money she planned to use to get out of Abbott Homes got her killed instead. It's just really sad.
McCoy's killers weren't the only ones after her money. I'm not kidding about loving you, quote unquote, a Baptist preacher from Fort Lauderdale wrote her. I feel like you are a part of my actual family. Yes, I do. Will you look into your pocketbooks and give Jesus a beautiful love offering of the largest bill you have? Or maybe you want to write a nice check. An Ohio minister offered to send her a special personal bottle of water from the River Jordan in exchange for a donation. A New York minister sent her a piece of sacred anointed wood, quote unquote, that she was to knock on 3 times and sleep on for one night only, quote unquote, then return in the mail with a donation of $18. Jesus fucking Christ.
It's like the predators come from all angles.
Is that less of a thing now? Or is it shifted?
No, it's shifted. There was just a story about how Truth Social, Donald Trump's version of Twitter, like doesn't have any guardrails, and that people have been preying on old people there, and it's through like campaign donations.
Yeah, no, I saw that the CNN WinRed thing where like there was that senile guy who had donated over $40,000 in the last year and a half, and he's like his cognitively so gone that he thought that Donald Trump and his family were directly texting him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Solicitations from fundamentalists predominated among the papers still scattered across McCoy's bedroom floor more than a month after her murder, when I was able to survey the inside of her apartment. Directives from public agencies relating to her welfare grants comprised most of the remainder of her papers. There was also a math workbook and civics worksheets, which McCoy had been using in general educational development (GED) courses at Mount Sinai in pursuit of a high school equivalent degree. Her daughter, Vernita McCoy, 25, hated to see Ruthie Mae send any of her few dollars to preachers. "Don't you understand? It's just a big con," she'd tell her mother. Ruthie Mae would respond, "You don't have any faith. You don't believe in anything." "It's not that I don't believe in anything," Vernita would say. "I just know a con when I see one." But Ruthie Mae would send the money anyway. She had a mind of her own, Vernita says. The apartment was nearly bare otherwise. Relatives had come weeks before to pick up her belongings.
Through the opening in her bathroom wall, where the medicine cabinet ought to have been, you could see the pipes that her killers wriggled past, and beyond that, the bathroom of 1108. The medicine cabinet in 1108 was confiscated by the state's attorney's office as evidence. McCoy's cabinet was never found, and it's not known whether it was in place before the intruders came through the wall. Vernita maintains that the burglars broke into her mother's apartment through the medicine cabinet once before, last year, and that although Ruthie Mae reported the break-in, no one from the CHA ever resecured her cabinet. Margaret Burridge, Ruthie Mae's next-door neighbor until she moved out in early April, says she recalls seeing the cabinet leaning against the tub of the bathroom earlier this year. There's no record in McCoy's housing file of her ever reporting a break-in or problem of any sort with her medicine cabinet, the CHA spokesperson says.
Still taped to McCoy's white cinder block bathroom wall, on either side of the space for the medicine cabinet, were pages from religious magazines describing miracles. "God will be your dentist," declared the clip on the left. Under that banner was a photograph of a young girl, mouth agape, a finger on the teeth that God had filled with silver, according to the accompanying story. On the other side of the opening was a story from The Power of the Holy Ghost magazine. "Thyroid condition vanishes," disclosing how the bulges in a woman's neck disappeared during Holy Week. The woman had discovered that the lumps were gone, the story said, when her husband, who had taken the bathroom mirror down to wallpaper, put it back up. A spooky clip to see, knowing what happened to McCoy. Was she waiting for some similar redemption to come through her bathroom mirror?
A few relatives attended the church service held for her on the south side April 30th. She was buried in Homewood that afternoon. Life was hard for Ruthie Mae, noted the bulletin distributed at the service. She was born in Hughes, Arkansas, one of 8 children. When she was small, her family, like numerous Southern black families then, moved to Chicago's South Side, looking for a more prosperous life. But the promise of the big city was sweeter than the reality. Just scraping along was a challenge for the large family and the teeming Black Belt. Ruthie Mae's father, now 87, and still living on Chicago's South Side, loaded coal onto wagons in various yards, earning a meager wage. Ruthie Mae attended Phillips High School for a little more than a year, but signs of mental illness began appearing when she was in her 20s. Her relatives say they don't know the exact nature of her illness and offer only hazy accounts of how it showed itself. She talked to herself, and she would burst with anger unexpectedly.
So it sounds like schizophrenia kind of adjacent.
Bipolar, probably something like that.
Her mother, a devout Baptist, chased us into church and taught us the way of the Lord, says a brother, Haywood McCoy. Now her siblings propose mainly spiritual explanations for what went wrong with Ruthie Mae. "There's such a thing as a devil, says Beatrice Gilbert, a sister. Haywood believes Ruthie Mae's problems began when she got out of God. A street preacher who says he can heal the sick and cast out devils, Haywood prayed for his sister. But you see, people have to want to get help, he said.
Oh, that's convenient.
Yeah.
Ruthie Mae never married. She was 27 when Vernita, her only child, was born at Cook County Hospital. The father didn't stick around long, and his desertion left Ruthie Mae bitter at men in general. Vernita had to stay with relatives off and on as a child because her mother was institutionalized several times. She managed okay when she was taking her medicine. When she wasn't, she talked to herself, sometimes swore at strangers on the street. I'd say, "Mama, why are you cussing at these people? You don't know them. You might get hurt," Vernita recalls. Ruthie Mae's hulking frame may have discouraged others from retaliating. She was 251 pounds, 5 feet 11 inches at her death, the coroner would determine.
So she's a big lady. If someone is heavy set and like as tall as like a tall man and they're clearly unwell, you're probably going to just let it go. Even on the streets, when someone's crazy, you just don't know what they're going to do. So you don't engage. You kind of like...
More than that, how much of that is something she started doing as a teenager to avoid the attention of men or people fucking with her?
Yeah.
And it just became a reflexive act of doing that because she was perceiving... If you're a sensitive person, you can feel when people have weird intent or they're not engaging with you in a way that makes you feel safe. And you're going to respond in a way that...
I mean, it just sounds like so stressful. And just trying to imagine a child growing up in an environment that is just so fucking stressful, like just 24/7.
You're not cute. There's nothing about you that people want. Clearly, she was someone who was a little challenging to be, and she wasn't like conventionally attractive. You know what I mean? There's like, which maybe would have worked against her, but like she was someone that people didn't want to deal with, period, right? And it was, it was just sad. It's very sad.
She worked some menial jobs, laundromat attendant, housekeeper, but her mental problems prevented her from holding a job more than a month or two, and she spent most of her adult life on aid. She and Vernita lived in Dearborn Homes, a Southside housing project, during Vernita's early years, and then in cramped ghetto apartments on the South and West Sides. Vernita spent some time in Cook County Jail in 1983 after being convicted of aggravated battery, the circumstances of which she'd rather not discuss. Ruthie Mae took care of Vernita's 1-year-old while Vernita was in Cook County Jail. When her basement apartment in Humboldt Park flooded, Ruthie Mae applied for emergency CHA housing. She asked in one letter to the CHA to be placed in Wentworth Gardens on the South Side and near relatives. In another letter, she asked specifically not to be placed in a high-rise. But beggars can't be choosers. She was offered an 11th floor unit in the Abbott Homes. In May of '83, she moved into apartment 1109.
From her 5th floor apartment in Abbott High Rise, Pat, 32, a client at the Mount Sinai Psychiatric Center, has a view of all the action. I hear shooting, I'm looking out the window, and I see police coming, and I say, I wonder who done got shot now. I see him come out, a 1440 with 2 bodies covered up, and I say, what happened, buddy? They found somebody dead in the apartment? What happened to the other one? Oh, he got shot. You know that woman over there in that other building? She got shot earlier today. I say, what's wrong with everybody? You think all that don't make people nervous? I better stay crazy. Unquote.
I like her.
The place Ruthie Mae was offered by CHA, her home of last resort, percolates with violence. Children are raised here amid the tumult and grow accustomed to it. I was discussing McCoy's murder one morning with a young man in the lobby of her building when a young woman walked by, a toddler in tow. She asked to speak to the man. As soon as I finished my business, he told her, I don't give a fuck about your fucking business, she screamed at him. You give me my fucking money. The toddler didn't even look up. So it's written in AAVE, and so we're reading it like that. I'm not trying to affect anything here.
Yeah. When I first came here, I used to feel so sorry for the children that I would almost cry, the janitor says. Just to know the terror they see, but they're so animalistic in their own right, in the games they play. I see little kids throwing bricks and bottles at each other, and this is their game. Now I get mad. God damn these little bastards. So this is predating the super predator rhetoric, right? So this is also kind of coming into the time where like crime was really bad in major cities. It was really bad, like in ways that we can't begin to imagine. And that had to do with like a lot of different things. It had to do with crack coming into neighborhoods, but it also had to do with people that had come back from Vietnam and had all kinds of weird fucked up PTSD, but they didn't know what PTSD was yet. And so you had also a lot of these people walking around that were just very fragile and could become unhinged very quickly. And then on top of that, Reaganomics had created all of this fucked up poverty. cuts to social welfare programs. So it was a stew of bad shit that made it really bad. And but it also created this rhetoric, and it's really uncomfortable to keep reading the words like animalistic because that was the rhetoric of the time. So like I said, we're reading an article as it was written in 1987. So bear that in mind.
I think there's also just a lot of fundamental inability to connect with the experience these people are having in poverty that creates it. It's that they're making a choice. And okay, to a certain degree, an action is a choice, but there are a lot of circumstances that set this up that they're completely being overlooked because people don't want to acknowledge that they've contributed to the conditions that create what is going on. They want to make it like a very localized problem when it's a very global thing.
Yes, agreed. About 3,600 people live in the Abbott homes. God damn. All of them Black, most of them younger than 18. Except for a few top drug pushers, everybody is poor. The average family in this census tract was pulling in a cool $4,500 a year, the 1980 census found. And times certainly haven't improved around here since.
What would that be, like 10 grand now? Like adjusted for inflation from 1980 to now? Because that's 50 years ago almost. So 44 years ago.
It'd be like, it'd probably be around like 10, maybe.
12, maybe?
I think I'm actually being generous. It'd probably be closer to like 8,000.
Jesus
Yeah.
Christ. Okay.
Yeah. About 85% of the families are headed by females. The lucky few, about 580 people, reside in 33 two-story row houses. Everyone else is in the 7 high-rises.
Residents of the ABLA are beaten, raped, and murdered more than twice as often as they are citywide. 47.8 violent crimes per 1,000 ABLA residents in 1986 compared with the 22.9 per 1,000 residents citywide. There are no crime figures specifically for the Abbott high-rises, but the rate in those buildings, ABLA's most hazardous, is undoubtedly far worse. Even by public housing standards, the place is bad news. ABLA ranks 5th among CHA developments in violent crime. Its rate significantly worse than those of Cabrini Green, 37.9 violent crimes per 1,000 residents, but you don't hear anywhere near as much about this near South Side project as you do about Cabrini Green, which sits not far from the Gold Coast, the lakefront, and downtown. Quote, the news media's offices are closer to Cabrini. It's easy to drive over there, Area 4 Detective Loser says. They never come over here. They might call on the phone, but they never come.
Abbott Homes' layout is a gangbanger's dream, designed as if to facilitate crime. In a 1972 study of New York City high-rises, renowned housing expert Oscar Newman found that crime rates increased with the height of the buildings, the size of the projects, and the distance of the buildings from the streets. Super blocks of high-rises like Abbott Homes were, in terms of crime, the worst possible combination for public housing. Newman wrote in his 72 book, Defensible Space, Crime Prevention Through Urban Design, the high-rises promote anonymous living, he wrote, making it less likely that residents will look out for their neighbors. The lack of streets isolates the project and makes routine police surveillance difficult. Writing specifically about the Abbott high-rises, Devereux Bowley Jr. echoed these sentiments in The Poorhouse, his 1978 book on Chicago's public housing. More than any project built in Chicago to that date, 1955, the overall feeling of Abbott Homes is forbidding and the human scale completely lost.
Yeah, that's what they get in that documentary, the Pruitt ego myth. They get into it's basically the same story, but it's in St. Louis, Missouri. Unfortunately, Abbott Homes was the precursor to the towering slum site developments built in Chicago in the late 50s and early 60s. Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor Homes, Stateway Gardens, and Rockwell Gardens. Projects Bowley called the unfortunate legacy of Elizabeth Wood's years as executive secretary of the CHA. Indeed, Wood directed the CHA in the late 40s and early 50s when most of these massive slum site projects were conceived. But she proposed such developments only after the city council blocked her attempts to build smaller projects in various neighborhoods, many of them white, throughout the city.
It's a NIMBY, not in my backyard. Yeah. In no project will you find stairwells darker or more forbidding than those in the Abbott Towers. Other projects have screened-in ramps, allowing some natural light to filter into the stairwells. But Abbott's corridors are completely enclosed. So when the light bulbs are burned out or missing in the stairwells, it's pitch black there. And the light bulbs are burned out or missing most of the time. There used to be 3 janitors per high-rise at Abbott, the janitor says. Now there's usually just 1. You got too much work to do to keep going over to the supply room to get light bulbs, he says. And then when you go, there's not any light bulbs or they give you 5 or 6. and then you put the bulbs in and the tenants steal them.
Spiraling drug addiction and ABLA has of late made the high-rises even more hazardous, say residents and others who work takes them into the projects. Quote, a year ago, we hardly ever had anyone involved in coke here, unquote, says Sandy Siegel, clinical coordinator of the Mount Sinai Hospital Community Psychiatric Center, which serves mainly ABLA residents. You had people doing reefer and PCP, and some heroin junkies, but cocaine addiction is rampant now in those buildings, and the need for money has soared. You put that on top of an already bad situation, and it's a nightmare.
We're going to stop there.
Yeah, it's a heavy note, man. This is a heavy...
It's a heavy one, but like I said, it's really good reporting, and I think this is just a subject people don't think about, and yeah, I wanted to platform really good independent journalism. And
it's a horrifying story. I mean, it
is, but I also feel like unrelated, but this election coming up, this is someone that wants to basically reinstate Reaganomics and and get rid of like social welfare and all of this stuff. So part of me is like, this is also just like, it could happen here. It could happen here. We could go back to that. This is what happens when you have Reaganomics and when you gut social welfare programs and when you deregulate everything.
Yeah.
So it's an important reminder that there's a human cost. There's a human cost to all those tax cuts that people want. Anyway.
Yeah.
We will finish part 2 and have it up before Halloween, so people won't have to wait for a week to get the next part.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll have it'll be a 2-parter, but it'll be a good one, and they'll be close together, so you guys can have them right away.
Yes.
If you're compelled.
Yes.
If you can stomach it, because damn, it's brutal, man.
But it's really good writing. It's really good journalism.